17 plantation owners on the night of August 1835. North Carolina districts died from each other within 28 days. Each death has taken shape. I'm constantly wet as I cut through the same point, the cross, the door to the victim's room. With blood, when they found dawn. Local governments fill in very deep details, and for almost 2 centuries. Historians tied these murders to the fact that survivors whispered. Preacher's prophecy. Tonight we will reveal a terrible truth. The most systematically organized by the prepared subordinates of America. A shaking month of adjusted horror. The foundations of the antebellum South. Before continuing the 17 stories with Pastor Josiah Cumberland. Cross the marked deaths in Chatham County and press this subscription button to ring the notification bell. Because stories like these are buried by time and fear, and deserve to be told. Also, please let me know in the comments you're listening to tonight. So let's discover how people are distorted. The interpretation of the Bible is a horrifying month plan in North Carolina history. Summer. In 1835, it was discovered that Chat's district owned by cotton prosperity and biblical enthusiasm. The area had some of the largest, stretching through the hills in the heart of North Carolina. A profitable plantation. Their success is built on the souls of over 4,000 people who have been reduced to slavery. The Pittsboro area locations eavesdropped on cotton merchants and slave merchants, but white quorums, the usual places, are scattered. The landscape is a monument to human slavery. Judge William Peon reigned. His impressive court building, the man whose final Presbyterian faith responded to him. An unwavering belief in the natural order of slavery. His plantation, Potenhole. He hired 200 slaves and served as a social center for the district elite. Padon was proud that he supported Christian leadership, disciplined through what he called daily prayers. A session that reminded me of the Bible duty of slaves to observe their owners. Most. Dear family was the planting cape at Cedar Glow and Fair Hilda Estres Riverside. Colonel Benjamin Clenshaw, a veteran of the war in 1812, controlled his plantation. Military apparently, his wife, Hararanian, retains the reputation of the charity Christian organization. That version. Charity is not spread to doubt the lessons of human property. A. Meanwhile, Fairhill builds his fortune in the spread of slaves, deals with people like livestock, and is sold. At the market. Round. Josiah Cumberland in the spring of 1835. Highlighted man drilling a gray hole. Eyes and voices that could swing the rafters, Cumberland appeared at the planting door, requiring God's calling. Serve a slave. His power seemed impeccable. The letters on church entrance to Virginia, worn by the Bible, who has demonstrated years of training in conversation methods. This assumes deep theological training. The planter had no idea about the Cumberland. It has an anger in itself, and it has been avoided by himself for 15 years. The family was torn apart at the auction block in Richmond. They only saw the preachers. He saw his opportunity. For God's revenge. The first overnight occurred in slaves on May 15, 1835. Grow plantations. Ella Laner Crenshaw, believing in religious training, granted permission to the meeting. This will make his slave more docile and obedient. She could not imagine her signing her husband's death. Order. Marcus, a slave in the house, learned to read and read the lessons of the children of Cleno, and first visited this. Meet skepticism. At the age of 32, he survived 20 years of slavery. Bow your head and reflect it to yourself. But something about Cumberland's strength upset him. From the beginning. The brothers and sisters have begun Cumberland, his voice is small and hardly higher than whispering. Quarter. Tonight, we are not gathering as slaves, but as God's elected people. Slaves were gathered, field hands, servants, stable workers sat there. How Cumberland opened his Bible for the outcome. And the Lord said to Moses, My people may go. But what will happen? When the Pharaoh refuses, what happens when the master is not paying attention to God's word? Cumberland's gray eyes covered the room, dragging each face. The Lord has been sent. Through Egypt. 7 plagues to break the will of the Pharaoh. But we are not. Moses anticipated God's intervention. We are the epidemic itself. Preacher /S. The word sent the cold down Marcus's spine, but did not expect sacred chills from Ireland to Cresho. Cumberland spoke about blood at the door. The blood of the oppressor as a sign of God's judgment. He described the night when the angels of God's death crossed. Egypt attacked the first people born from people who had not heard the warning. The Lord works with man's hands, Cumberland continues, and his voice grows. Strength. When the Israelites crossed Jordan, they were not sitting without the cold, and they waited for the wall to fall. They are. He passed, they fought, they said God had promised them. He was looking forward to it. Conspiracy. Come. Movement, he cuts a rough cross, his hands are stable despite the weak light. This is our sign, he said. Holds engraved symbols. When you see this sign, you will see that the time has come. When you see this cross is marked with blood, you will know that God's judgment has begun. Marcus felt his cold. It is not the Christianity of red or forgiveness he heard in the chapel of the plantation. That was something. The darker, more major gospel of vengeance, wrapped in Bible power. But the others in the room are leaning forward in hunger in their eyes. 20 years old. Work, family, torn, daily humiliation and pioneering the night. The fear prepared them for another salvation. When Cumberland spoke about God's justice, they heard a promise regarding human revenge. The preacher's voice fell into a whisper, which filled the entire room. In 28 days. The moon is dark, the night is long, and the prophecy is carried out. 7 by 7. Number of completed. That night, the angel of death visits 17 homes. And in the morning, the blood on their door announces that this decision has arrived in the Chatta district. Week. After this first vigil, Reverend Cumberland passed through the county as a godly purpose. Its reputation quickly spread among the black community. Powerful. Preachers are preachers who can transfer their most strengthened souls to tears of repentance. Planting owner contributed. As he leads the service for slaves. I am sure his religious training will become more obedient. Worker Heroinina Crenshaw has become Cumberland's most enthusiastic boss. A deep, but small faith woman, she organized a chain of delivering preachers on 17 different plantations. 4 weeks. Think about the souls we can save, she told him. Her husband at breakfast, her eyes are wonderful with Christian goals. Think about what happens to employees more when their hearts are properly leveled at the will of God. Read the cotton prices for roll registration. He did not use religion outside his usefulness to maintain order. But if his livestock preacher could prevent superficial paths and uprisings, he was ready to withstand the costs. What? None of them understood that Cumberland Circuit provided complete intelligence to the most systematic ones. The planned uprising of slaves in American history. He studied at each plantation. The provisions of the calculated weapon determine the most cruel supervisor. The master dealt with human property with certain cruelty. That's even more important, he decided. The potential recruits, slaves, hearts were not completely broken, that rage always burned under their forced subordinates. Marcus discovered that despite his development he was involved in these meetings. Anxiety. Cumberland's knowledge of the Bible was undeniable, but his interpretation became even more cruel. Last week. The preacher said JL passed his ankle through Chicola / Kill Skull, David and Judith Goliath and behead Holofernes, always. It emphasizes that God worked through human tools to fulfill his justice. The Lord does not ask us, "Love our enemies when they are Philistines," Cumberland announced during its service at Riverside Field. He asks us, "Trust him that his time is perfect. He is an absolute judge." The preacher's eyes. I found Marcus in the crowd, but the workless faith is dead, brother. Faith without action is apostasy. After each service, Cumberland chooses a specific slave for private instructions. Always the strongest, evil, those eyes still lit. A small number of elected officials attracted special personal attention. A visit in which Cumberland shares advanced theological concepts of God's justice and human institutions. Marcus. He later learned that these private sessions focused on practical issues disguised as biblical instructions. Cumberland taught them the tools of justice. Because pruning a knife can become a David's scarf like a rope. The purpose of a prison is that daily tools can become tools of God's will. He talked about time, cooperation, and the most frightening thing, the importance of keeping the signs appropriate so that God's work is recognized. The influence of the preacher has spread beyond his chosen student. The words traveled. The facility enslaved slaves to a man who spoke of freedom not as a reward for the distant heavens but as an earthly possibility. The story began to cycle elsewhere when slaves raised themselves. Where blood bought freedom. However, Cumberland's increasing influence has led to some surprising hints. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a district doctor and gentleman. Abolitionist sympathy began to notice an uneasy pattern in the preacher's rhetoric. I visited some. Serving out of curiosity, Hartwell discovered Cumberland's theology and worried about his accent to violence and revenge. There's something unnatural in that person, Hartwell said at Sarah at dinner. His knowledge. The Bible is impressive, but his understanding of Christian love seems incomplete. Dr. Hartwell is watching well. He died in his clinic to admit when someone spoke too much knowledge about the murder. Comfortable. Meanwhile, Judge Poton stayed happy without knowing the storm. They gather around his district. His plantation continued to operate gently. His court continued. He continued to apply the law and his faith to ensure God's natural order. With white Christians upstairs and enslaved Africans below, they will last forever. Cumberland dates. The prophecy approached as a thunderstorm on the horizon that could be seen for those who knew where to look and where they could not see. Who is sure such a storm will not be able to touch their world? Marcus was made in the third week of August. Don't know what he is testifying. His brothers change, the workers were invincible. Sung by the tension. Under their daily lives, important opinions are exchanged for work songs. A new disobedience in a voice that once trembled in front of the supervisor's whiskers. Advanced training Cumberland. It has been extended beyond the limits of the former student. When it seemed like an innocent collection of prayers, the preacher was. Distribution of tasks disguised as biblical roles. Some slaves are abandoned. Like Ezekiel, the guard responsible for observing the movements of the master. Supervisor. Others have become messengers such as the angels of Revelation code. Information between plantations. The most trustworthy person has acquired the role of executioner, like the angel of death. Exodus. Cumberland has never used this word directly, but prefers to speak about the tools of God's justice. Preacher's tissue engineering lies in creating complex communication using familiar Bible images. Net. Spiritual sparage in one way showed that they were ready for harvest. He was in protection. The Psalms were presented during Sunday service, sent by Time Information. Cumberland crosses. I carved the senses I've acquired. Different depths and corners of the tree sent different messages to people who knew how. Read them. Marcus's position as the previous home gives him a unique understanding of the plot. A complete exchange of white communities. He saw the Arilana Crenshaw Project planning a public gathering. At the same time, marked the ministry of prosperous preachers. Unusual care and land workers practice movements that have nothing to do with cotton harvesting. Largely. The moment of cooling came during Cedarglow's final education session at Cumberland. The preacher gathered it most. Trusted followers in the forest behind slave districts where the sounds of adjacent streams are hidden. Vote. In the flickering light of a pine torch, Cumberland is. The volume of that plan. The night of August 28th will be our Easter, he said. His gray eyes reflect the flames like a basin of melted metal. But this time they don't seek protection. We are angels and the speed of their doors is not marked, not lamb. It's blood, but there's their own guilt blood. Cumberland has created details. Map, rude, but accurate, showing 17 plantations and target routes. Between them. Each location was marked with numbers indicating the order of the attack and the required time. Prevents word propagation between properties. The beauty of God's plan. Cumberland continues, its simplicity. These people believe in them. Certainly, they ruined our mood, divided our families, and convinced us of this resistance. Impossible. They can't imagine it, so they sleep safely in their beds. The very people they crush can have intelligence, organization and fair rage. Such businesses need to be coordinated. As he explained, the preacher's voice was sweet and almost soft. Mass murder logistics. Each target was not randomly selected, but was established. A detailed assessment of crimes against humanity. Colonel Clensu. Its systematic cruelty. Judge Patong said on legal support for slavery. Fairchild for treating people as multiplied reserves. And 14 others. The name whispered in the slave district, which was a synonym for cruelty. When the morning arrived on August 29th, we concluded the intersection of Cumberland, 17. Blood declares this district that God's patience is over. Survivors will know their time. The decision has come. And maybe they'll finally understand. The fact that the people they enslaved are not property, but people who can suffer in vengeance. Marcus. He felt his world see his axis. It was calculated, not a trend that was passionate about people who were hopeless. A systematic plan of revolution. Cumberland became a dispersed rage of slavery and hundreds of souls reduced to teeth. It's a scary precision weapon. But even when Marcus realized the perfect glow of Cumberland plan, he suspected that the preacher's motives were deeper. Bible justice. Cumberland's hatred was personal. Something beyond theological beliefs. Men are about the evil of slavery, and others power and. They tested them with their own eyes, and his knowledge of planting surgery seemed too detailed. I only saw them as visiting ministers. As night approached, Marcus was caught. Between praise and fear. Part of this is excited by the idea of their oppressors who ultimately faced the consequences for their actions. However, the opponent, 32, supported it. In 2019, he acknowledged that the Cumberland Project was justified. Ultimately, it brings disaster to each slave in a guilt or innocent district. The final piece of the puzzle was 3 days before Marcus was scheduled to be upset when he heard it. Cumberland speaks quietly with Solomon. The oldest hand planting. Preachers are cautious. Ministerial emphasis rebutted for a while, revealing the dialect of a man who learned not to talk. In the seminar room, but in the slave district. 20 years old, Cumberland. He whispered, his voice heavy with personal flour. 20 years have passed since I sold my Sarah and our kids in southern Georgia. 20 years of research, sadness, and planning for this moment. He saw the stars seen through the cabin window. God can work through human instruments, but sometimes these tools have their own reasons. Accepting the profession. Marcus finally understood. Pastor Josiah Cumberland. He was not an extreme preacher ruled by theological beliefs. He was an ancient slave absorbed by very human desires. To revenge, use religion as a weapon and justification. I was always going to do that. Cumberland's true truth discovery transformed Marcus into something approaching terrorism. If the preacher was certainly a former slave, his presence in the Chatter district was at that level of risk. I don't understand any of the white communities. Back in the South, slaves fled and chased the hopeless people. And dangerous. However, he planned revenge and spent 20 years fleeing slaves. Although he is disguised as a minister of God, it was something outside of their worst nightmare. Marcus began paying closer. Beware of Cumberland's actions. Carefully look for persistent facade cracks. Preacher /S. His knowledge of the Bible was authentic, but his knowledge of the lives of slaves was also his knowledge. He knew what culture needed. Destruction crashes in the human soul. It was not academic knowledge, but experience lived, and it explained personal anger hidden under his biblical rage. 3 days ago, Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a planned uprising, made a discovery that is supposed to change everything. Visiting. The doctor, a great slave to the Peton plantation, noticed that Cumberland was participating in what appears to be an awareness. Field hands. The slave sobbed, asking for forgiveness for the crime he was trying to commit during Cumberland. He provided what appeared to be remission for future violence. Hartwell's medical training forced him to see people. Nature and something in the scene seemed deeply and bad. What? In the evening he went to Pittsburgh and asked for a meeting with Judge Peton in the court building. Your Honor, Hartwell. It began with caution, knowing that criticism of the district's religious renewal was undesirable. I have this preacher's concerns about Cumberland. Some of his theological positions seem extreme. Judge Peton. He looked up at the legal documents in irritability. Doctor, I will remind you that Mr. Cumberland is great. Link. Men have done more to reassure our slave population than we have implemented in recent years. This is exactly what bothers me, Hartwell replied. My experience is that men are male. Even violence covered in biblical language preaches departmental violence. They often refer to more than a phorik use of theology. Peton refused. Dr. Zellweger. I'm afraid of your North. Through education, we doubt passionate Christianity. Cumberland preaches God's justice, like an ancient prophet. If to hand them out is better than putting God's fear into our people. Hartwell left the disappointed court, but not defeat. That night he made the decision to pursue him for the rest of his life. He decides to explore Cumberland. Regardless, it was rejected by district officials to avoid taking risks again. Use your medical practices as a cover. Hartwell began visiting the plantation, where he preached Cumberland and checked the health of his slaves. In fact, they gather information about the activities of preachers. The fact that he discovered something cooled with bones. Cumberland held private meetings with certain slaves and distributed what they thought. Tasks and performance of language coded in Angel's Night. Walking between men. Meanwhile, Elilan Crenshaw has attached the latest touch to her public collection. Celebrating Cumberland Province. The invitation was sent to 17 planters in Cumberland. The circuit and event were scheduled for the evening of August 29. Hours after Cumberland's planned uprising. The irony was not lost for Marcus. Prepare for a party that was supposed to celebrate a preacher trying to kill a guest. How he honed his money. He then arranged flowers, and Marcus fought with impossible decisions. Caveat. The master who enslaved him or allowed him to revenge, which he took for granted. Cumberland was visible. Marcus's sense of inner struggle. The preacher on the morning of August 27. Appears in Marcus's cabin before dawn and carries the Bible he has worn. He booked a gentle expression for his most sensitive theological discussion. Brother Marcus, Cumberland said. Often we stop by a rough wooden stool next to the Marcus bed. I feel. To doubt your heart. Perhaps we must study what writing about behavior in the face of evil teaches us. Over the next hour, Cumberland unveiled his important theological training to justify the massacre. He spoke about Samson drawing the temple, killing the prophets of Eli, Baal. Jesus himself makes money for the temple with the whip. Each Bible example has been carefully selected. It is not only necessary to demonstrate, but also to demonstrate the recognition of violence in the service of God's justice. God doesn't ask us. We love our enemies more than our kids love, he said. He's gray, Cumberland. Eyes, boredom to Marcus, soul. He doesn't ask us to forgive those who remain unexplored, they continue their evil. The master of this district had it. Years to study their consciousness to recognize the humanity of those who oppress them. Instead, they hardened their minds, like Pharaoh's, and like Pharaoh's, they will face the consequences of their stubbornness. Marcus found. Despite his reserves, he nods. Cumberland's logic was fascinating and his knowledge of the Bible. It is impressive, and his personal charisma is overwhelming. But under theological debate, Marcus heard something else. A man's voice who decided to accept hatred and not heal her, found in religion. Extremism is the ideal excuse for highly human revenge. How Cumberland left. In the house he stopped by the door and saw Marcus on what was approaching. Tomorrow night. Brother, you will understand why God gathered us together. You'll think you can sometimes be merciless. They must be to suffer, ours, and to put an end to them. August 28. Autumn. I'm clear and hot. I feel like I'm breathing as if I'm dead. Owned to hot honey. Selected slaves throughout the child's district. I went to daily activities while concealing tools, visualizing tasks. And I am sure that their mental preparation for the fact that Cumberland has convincing them is a sacred work. Marcus spent the day in the state. Drawing in fear, taking into consideration his final time, he sees the progression of the sun in the sky, as condemned. In the evening, when stars begin to appear on cedar plantations, he made his decision. But whether it warns Colonel Crenshaw or joins the angels of Avenger Cumberland, he is still. I wasn't entirely sure. The night of August 28, 1835 began with a record. I've calmed down. Throughout the Chatham district, planting owners settled on them. The evening procedure, I don't know that it will be their last night. In the slave districts throughout the area, which are Cumberland's followers, in their opinion, are slavery. Marcus chose that aspect, but it's lower than the solution. The provision of an inevitable tragedy. In the middle of the night he slipped out of the cabin and made a path. The darkness of the big house, his heart strikes at each stage. He decided to warn Colonel Crenshaw. He has no loyalty, but he could not become an accomplice in that he would definitely become an innocent massacre with the perpetrator. However, when Marcus went to the entrance behind the mansion, he discovered it was too late. The kitchen door was held on the beach, and muffled sounds of voices emerged through it. Cumberland Smesican's unique whisper. With the nerve reactions of his disciples. The preacher must not forget what he said, we are God's tools. Justice, not a general murderer. Each death must be accurate, clean and marked. With a sign of prophecy. The bloody cross declares to the world that God's patience is over. Marcus approaches, his bare feet hanging over the soft grass. Through the crack in the door he could see Cumberland standing on the body of Colonel Clenho, the owner of the plantation. The blood united under a rough wooden cross placed on his chest. The show was as shocking as Marcus. He almost screamed, stopped, and only his hand was placed against his mouth. Karenina Creno was sitting in a chair. Nearby, his eyes are horrifying. The preacher's movements were calm and almost ritual, as if he was leading a religious service. Orchestra murder. You've been appreciated and found desire, Cumberland. He was almost dying, his voice possessed the same biblical authority that he used during his preaching. Your husband is screaming. A land that is capable and demands justice for 20 years of cruelty. The family collapsed and was stolen for the rest of their lives. He saw Eleanor with these sharp gray eyes. You called me a man. About God, and perhaps I am. But I am also the man whose wife and children were sold. Far from him, whose family has been torn apart to increase your profits. Karenina's voice broke as she whispered. In the name of Christ. The name of Christ. Cumberland's laughter was like broken glass. You call Christ. The creation of their wealth regarding human slavery. You talk about mercy among your supervisors. A child brand like livestock. He raised a carved cross, his rough surface is dark. With blood. That's my mercy, Mrs. Clanshaw. Fasting instead. Decades of suffering. Marcus moved in fear at his followers in Cumberland. According to the plan, the practice of efficiency is practiced throughout the home, which is clearly and in detail. They knew where to find exactly where to plant weapons, values, and most of all, recordings that document them. Legal status as property. We spoke with a few months of careful steps in their actions. Preparation. But Martix is scared more than anything, so that's what makes this scene aware. It was repeated at 17 plantations at the same time. Cumberland did not plan a single attack, but a revenge adjustment campaign covering 3 districts. And insist on the lives of each large slave owner in the area. Like reading. Thinking, Cumberland turned to the door where Marcus was hidden. To go out. Brothers Marcus. God's work is not intended to witness secrets. Marcus didn't have it. Option, except that you enter the kitchen, the smell of blood mixes with the extension. Dinner. Cumberland's smile was soft along his paternal lines when he said. For a terrible scene. How much do you see God's justice? The work? The preacher asked. Colonel Crenshaw has not died in a dream. As a natural death, however, he is forced to wake up and realize and resist the consequences of his choice. His wife. He gives a message about what is happening to those who benefit from human suffering. Are you going to make her live? Cumberland nodded slowly. Someone must have testified. A story of the night when God's patience finally ends. He put his bloody hands on Marcus' shoulder. But I fear that your hesitations show where your loyalty truly exists today. You came to the warning. So what about them? Marcus couldn't force himself to lie. Please don't stay. Owner's blood pool. He nodded quietly, waiting for Cumberland's judgment. To his surprise, the preacher's expression remained soft. I understand, brother. 20 years old. The air conditioner does not go out in the evening. But now your master is dead and he remains unchanged. Question. This will help us finish God's work. Otherwise, we'll join those who see us back in the chain. A. The Cumberland choice offered no choice at all. Will you take part in mass murder? Start next to the master. Marcus looked into the kitchens of other slaves. Man who he has known for years and has seen the same mixture of fear and joy in his eyes. A crossroads of lines that can never be crossed. Other plantations, Marcus? He asked quietly. Cumberland confirmed that 16 other crosses had been cut. I have it. Dawn, the great owner of each of the slaves of the 3 districts, respects his decision. Survivors will understand that the obvious order can be cancelled overnight. How? According to Cumberland, Marcus realized that the preacher's plan was far beyond the limits of simple vengeance. It should have been a message that spreads fear into the South and demonstrates that people have been enslaved. Not only did he have the ability to organize resistance, but he also had the attacks of intellectual coordinates. Far away. But Marcus understood something about that Cumberland. It seemed to have lost sight of his theological confidence. This bloody night comes. Awful reward for each slave in a guilty or innocent area. The white community's response was quick and ruthless, and seemed kind in the oppression of the past 20 years. Comparison. The sound of the horses of distance interrupted Marcus's thoughts. Cumberland's expression became uneasy from victory when anxiety approached. Dr. Hartwell, Cumberland followers whispered urgently. Comes with Sheriff Davis and 6 men. Cumberland's eye. He was completed when he realized that a carefully established plan was unleashed. Someone discovered a plot. And he warned the authorities. The preacher saw Eleanor Cleanzo in something approaching regret. It looks like, Our message will be incomplete, he said quietly. But perhaps the God's time. It's more perfect than mine. Harry Leonard Crenshaw's life prevented the end of the bloodiest uprising of slaves in American history. Medical training of doctors forced him to recognize models that others had missed. 3 sudden deaths. Last week, the slave showed signs that he appears to be very religious, but that Hartwell. Symptoms created by psychological disruption under severe pressure were in fact. When Hartwell discovers it. The 3 dead slaves were part of Cumberland's inner circle, he realized that he had not testified. A religious revival, but a revolutionary formation. His midnight trip to this intelligent Sheriff Davis. They encouraged education in a hurry, but they arrived at Cedar Grove. It's too late to save Colonel Crenshaw's life. The kitchen conflict lasted only 1 minute. Cumberland, met. Choosing either surrender or martialism, he chose either. Instead, he caught and pushed Eleanor Cleanzo. The throat knife is used as a shield, and its subscribers are distributed overnight. Do you call this justice? The criminal cried out at the armed man sliding down in the kitchen. The planter dies and you mobilize. The whole neighborhood. How many slaves have died under your clock? And where was the urgency? Sheriff Davis, A practical person who saw enough violence in his career tried to agree. To release Ms. Clenchey, and guarantees a fair trial. You have the opportunity to express your world in court. Cumberland's laughter was bitter. A fair trial. Who is the courtyard? What kind of Jew apprentice? He pushed the blade nearby. Draw a thin line of blood on Haranina's neck. There is no justice for people like me in your legal system. There. It's never been, never before. Dr. Hartwell moved forward, his voice softened. And professional. Cumberland, or whatever your real name is, you are a person. Intelligence and education. You know the murder of Mississippi Crino 1. Something. This only guarantees that your story will die with you. For a moment. Cumberland's knife fight faded. I told him, he whispered. My story. Written for 20 years of grief on children sold to parents behind broken cotton and cane. My story is like me, so my story is not important. He is not permitted to import. It was Marcus who finished the conflict. He moved slowly like that. To not be scared of anyone, he went to Cumberland, his voice is soft but difficult. Brotherland, He said using his favorite title. You have taught me that God works through human tools. Probably a doctor. Hartwell is also his instrument. Maybe your true mission isn't to kill, it's bear witness. Anger for supporting. I looked exhausted for 20 years. He released Harry Crenshaw and threw a knife. His shoulders were driving as if he had finally been driving. He took them off. Me, he said quietly, Josiah Freeman. I was born. Slaves of Dandridge Plantation in Virginia. 20 years ago, they sold my wife Sarah and our 3 children. The merchant goes to Georgia. I've never seen it again. The revelation of Cumberland's true personality sent shocking. Signing to the white community in the Chatham district. The previous slaves not only escaped slavery, they returned. Their most private and most accessed mostly by the ministers. It was possible to organize a massacre that would suffer the lives of 17 people. The following investigation showed the horrifying refinement of the Cumberland Project. Hidden County was a detailed card for weapon cache, planting arrangements, and coded. A document that talks about innovative networks that go far beyond the limits of a night of violence. Majority. All Bitter Things were a personal magazine in Cumberland, documenting 20 years of meticulous planning, theologian. A systematic set of research and followers in the South. Elenina Crenshaw was injured. Living has become an unexpected advocate for understanding the roots of the hem. With scandalized testimony. Her communication circle, she is not a monster, Cumberland. A wonderful person brought to extremes of unbearable losses. He knew the Holy Bible better than our own minister, she said. Court during Cumberland trials. It had a better understanding of human nature than our judges. If we treat people, not property, may not have Josiah Freeman not become Cumberland's pastor. Trial. He himself became an emotional state. Attract journalists for Boston and Charleston. Cumberland protection. The attorney appointed by the court was a young man named Daniel Fletcher, who never considered the capital case. But Fletcher acknowledged that Cumberland's tales offer an unusual opportunity to reveal the cost of humans for slavery. National. Within 3 days of testimony, Cumberland quietly detailed the systematic dehumanization. He transformed her from her husband and his father into a tool of revenge. He spoke about the children sold. A legal system that views the mother of a family who destroyed prophets and people as livestock. I won't ask for mercy, Cumberland ended with his final declaration to the court. I only ask you to understand why mercy came to you. That's not possible for me. When you make people's assets, you cannot be surprised. They try to find humanity by all necessary means. Judge Poton. The presidency of the same courtyard court in the court he spent years in guarantees compliance with the legal framework. Slavery discovered that he faced questions that he never allowed to consider. The defendant is in front of him. He was clearly guilty of murder and conspiracy, but he became a victim of the system in which Poton was. He dedicated his career to maintain. The judges were discussed 6 hours ago. Return with the invader verdict against all loads. Cumberland is the death that everyone expects. Paused. However, the impact of his trial has spread far beyond the courtroom. Marcus testified about Cumberland's employment and psychological manipulation methods. He himself is in an impossible position after the trial. He helped capture the murderer, but he betrayed him too. The confidence of the person who provided him with freedom. Other slaves of Shadalgolf thought of it with doubt. The white community continued to think it was potentially dangerous. Dr. Hartwell. Meanwhile, he was persecuted by the knowledge that his intervention prevented the massacre, but that was also guaranteed. The basic injustice that Cumberland exposed will undoubtedly continue. In his private newspaper, he wrote, "Thousands of people have been accused of continuing to suffer, and they have a system of creating people like Josiah Freeman." The execution took place on October 15, 1835, in front of a crowd of over 3,000 spectators. Those who testified to the death of slaves who traveled from all parts of the nation and dared to challenge nature. Order. Cumberland ran his death with the same gentle strength he brought to his sermon with his last. A gallows moment to deliver what many considered the most powerful sermons when they were in the Liba audience in North Carolina. I'll go to my death. My children know that if they are still alive, they will remain in slavery, he said. The voice carries a gentle crowd. I know that the system I fought will continue to destroy my family. In addition to treating the human soul as an object, it also builds wealth after suffering. But I also know that other men follow, Josiah Freem increases and eventually. It may not be my life, but in the end this great sin requires a complete explanation. Cumberland. The prophecy has proven to be more accurate than you could imagine. The history of the preacher uprising is widespread. South, both forest fires, inspire both fear and hope among slaves. Slave. The refined nature of the plan, theological and closest depth of knowledge. The success of his plot broke the comfortable fiction with slaves. Their content. In response, Southern state legislative bodies are adopting increasingly serious laws. Limitations on slave movements, prohibiting literacy training, restrictions on religious conferences. That exact measure. Only an increase in despair that created people like the first Cumberland, designed to prevent future uprisings. Place. Marcus lived another 43 years and observed the Cumberland Civil War. He predicted the liberation that followed Cumberland's death and subsequent battle. In 1878, 3 years before his death, he gave a final interview with a journalist. We provide the most detailed report on Raleigh's News and the Observer's Cumberland plot. It survives at a historic entrance. Pastor Cumberland wasn't good. Man, Marcus thought, his voice weighs decades, He wasn't a bad guy. He was a broken man violated by violence. White people will understand only the language he believed in. The tragedy is that he was probably right. Eleanor Clenzaho. Please don't retire me after my husband's death. She spent the rest of the year quietly and gradually spoke. Liberation, although his efforts have largely failed. The injury this August night has changed radically. Her understanding of the world she lived forced her to resist the price of a human prosperity, and she took. Was provided. Physical evidence of Cumberland's plot has gradually faded over the years. Sculpture. The cross was burned or buried. The hidden weapons have been confiscated, and the documents are stated by the Revolution. The network was sealed in legal records where few historians studied when Liba studied it. However, the psychological impacts of these 28. The day of 1835 lasted for several generations. Local folk tales have changed Cumberland. From flesh and blood to things that are approaching legend. Some stories portrayed him as the demon who was sent to him. Check the faith of Christian slaves. Others described him as Anja the Avenger, his return was planned. Signs and signs. Certainly he was just someone who was brought to extremes. The unbearable loss was more frightening than any supernatural explanation. Dr. Hartwell continued his clinic until his death in 1859. However, he did not halt the investigation of the wider network than Cumberland, which was suggested during the trial. Private documents of a private doctor found in his 10-year attic were revealed in a detailed correspondence with Northern abolitionist recorded the complex Underground Railway. A few years ago, someone doubted their existence, North Carolina. Most amazing. Above all, there is a note from Hartwell, suggesting that the Cumberland Uprising is not an isolated incident, but is partially large. A sample of slave resistance, where authorities are systematically hidden to maintain public order. Link. Similar religious awakenings in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. It suggested that Cumberland's method was reproduced by other hopeless people. Efforts to turn theological beliefs into revolutionary actions. The court where Cumberland was brought to trial was destroyed by a fire in 1863. Sherman walks through North Carolina. The residents said flames. They burned out from the extraordinary strength in a room where the tests occurred and could not erase the water. Each registration of the procedure is still there until it reaches ashes. If it was supernatural interference or simple coincidence, the destruction of the Cumberland Court's entry guaranteed its full history. I would never be completely known. They survived the fragments, which are newspapers. Descriptions, personal letters and evidence of people like Marcus who witnessed first-hand events. A. The plantation of Shaw itself was abandoned in 1847 after Leland's death. A. Slave. For 10 years, the forest began to recover the buildings where 17 crosses were cut and the revolution was carried out. Born. But perhaps this is what makes Cumberland's story such a persecution. Not what we know, but what remains hidden. For almost 2 centuries, historians have rejected reports of his uprising. Local folk tales. It is impossible to believe that slaves can organize such a complex plot. It's only now that people like Josiah Freeman are beginning to realize that they weren't outrageous. An inevitable product of a system that views people as property. What do you think of this story? Do you think Cumberland's method was justified by the circumstances? Or do you think his theological argument was simply a rationalization of revenge? Leave a comment below and share your reflections with others who want to explore the darkest heads in American history. If you like this story in the hidden uprising and want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel. Share Bell's notifications and this video with someone. Please share it with someone. Remember that the most important historical lessons often come from stories that people have tried their best to forget. A. The legacy of Saint Josiah Cumberland, or Josiah Freeman, as we really called him. It goes far beyond the limits of the 17 crosses that he had planned to cut his blood. His story. For each statistics on slavery, remind each of each legal document that considers people to be property. There were real people with practical hypotheses of a kind of system, real families, real dreams. And the true ability of love and hatred. The Cumberland uprising failed. His immediate purpose, but he managed to demonstrate that Balea America refused. Acknowledge that enslaved people had intelligence, organizational abilities and morality. The beliefs needed to challenge the systems that suppressed them. The complex nature of the plot. Even the warmest defenders of slavery are forced to resist the embarrassing truths their property constituted. People who have complex thoughts, deep emotions, and systematic resistance. The 17 masters who died on August 28, 1835 were not random victims. Carefully selected symbols of a system built on human suffering. Cumberland's choice to be careful of their rude death. The wooden cross was not just a symbol, but a deliberate theological declaration. On the nature of justice and the price of ransom. In the end, perhaps, Cumberland's greatest success was not the life he took, but the questions he forced people to ask. His story. It allows us to study not only the mechanisms of slavery, but also its psychological and mental costs. Those who were enslaved by those who took part in their enslavement. A. Blood of this door at 17 door. Freeman remains a certain part of American history. That prediction regarding possible calculations has proven accurate. It took 30 years, and the war costs over 600,000 lives. Do that. Think about what's comfortable tonight when you lie in your bed. A hypothesis that controls your world. Think about what kind of fraudulent systems you can participate without using. Understand this. And history tells us. When people are pushed beyond their limits of endurance. The family is destroyed, their humanity is rejected, and some decide to respond to it inevitably. The cruelty they know. Cumberland pastors may be cut and marked with trees. Blood. But deeper intersections, those who have noticed all the souls affected by slavery, spend more time. Employment if they are generally healed. The preacher's prophecy was made. It's not what he expected. Justice has come, but it happened not in the middle of the night, but in politics and war. Murder. Freedom arrived, but it arrived imperfectly and imperfectly. Leave a new struggle for future generations to decide. Where's the file that survived the building? Fire was a testimony that avoided destruction, and in the memory that was passed down by black families. This 28-day history of 1835 continued to whisper that unpleasant truth. Too necessary slavery on the price of the horrific arithmetic of injustice and human suffering. Inhibitors and suppression. This is the story they tried to fill. The story they wanted is forgotten. However, some truths are too strong to hide forever. And some crosses. After cutting, the time itself leaves a mark that cannot be erased.